There exist predictions that disturb not because they announce fire falling from the sky or cities crumbling in an instant, but because they describe something far more insidious: the quiet unraveling of the structures we mistake for permanence, the slow fracture of systems we believed were immune to collapse, and the psychological erosion that precedes visible catastrophe by months or years, leaving populations confused, divided, and unable to recognize the danger until it has already reshaped the world around them. The year 2026 has emerged repeatedly in certain interpretations of historical prophetic literature, not as a single moment of destruction but as a convergence point. A year when multiple stress lines meet and deepen, when the cracks that have been forming beneath the surface of modern civilization become impossible to ignore, when the fragility of institutions, the volatility of collective psychology, and the brittleness of consensus reality reveal themselves in ways that cannot be easily repaired or forgotten. Among the figures whose symbolic language continues to provoke unease across centuries, Michel de Nostradamus, known as Nostradamus, occupies a peculiar position, not as a fortune-teller in the theatrical sense, but as someone who appeared to perceive patterns in human behavior, cycles of collapse, and recurring dynamics of fear, power, and moral disintegration that manifest across different eras in different forms, but with disturbingly similar outcomes. His quatrains, written in deliberately obscure language, mixing French, Latin, and symbolic imagery, have been subjected to endless interpretation, much of it shallow, sensationalist, or shaped by confirmation bias. Yet beneath the noise there remain certain passages and patterns that, when examined through the lens of systemic vulnerability and psychological breakdown, become far more unsettling than any prediction of natural disaster, because they seem to describe not external catastrophes, but internal failures. The collapse of trust, the disintegration of shared reality, the paralysis of decision-making structures, and the quiet surrender of ethical frameworks under pressure, all conditions that make populations vulnerable to manipulation, violence, and despair in ways that earthquakes and floods cannot. The purpose here is not to persuade you that Nostradamus possessed supernatural foresight or that 2026 is predetermined to be a year of horror, but rather to examine 5 interpretations associated with his work that, when connected to observable trends in political fragility, environmental stress, information warfare, and collective psychology, form a narrative of potential breakdown that is worth confronting, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of the recognition that awareness itself can be a form of resistance, that understanding the shape of possible darkness allows us to make different choices, and that there is a kind of dignity in facing uncomfortable possibilities directly, rather than dismissing them or pretending they do not exist. If you are willing to sit with that discomfort, to consider scenarios that do not offer easy resolution or comforting conclusions, then what follows is an invitation to think deeply about fragility, consequence, and the strange ways that symbolic language sometimes captures truths that literal language cannot. And if this kind of inquiry resonates with you, consider leaving your name and city in the comments as a marker of engagement, a signal that there are others who prefer clarity over comfort. And share this with those who might benefit from confronting these ideas, not to spread fear, but to encourage the kind of reflection that strengthens, rather than weakens our capacity to endure uncertainty. Nostradamus has often been framed as a predictor of spectacular events, yet the more disturbing readings of his work suggest he was far more interested in describing the conditions that make catastrophe inevitable, the psychological states, the institutional failures, the moral compromises, and the collective delusions that precede visible breakdown, which is why the worst predictions attributed to him are often not about meteor strikes or alien invasions, but about subtler and more insidious processes. The kinds of collapse that happen slowly enough that populations adjust to each new degradation until they no longer recognize how far they have fallen. The kinds of fractures that appear first as increased anxiety, then as polarization, then as violence, then as the wholesale abandonment of shared frameworks for understanding reality itself. In this context, 2026 emerges in certain interpretive traditions, not as a year of singular apocalypse, but as a threshold year, a point at which multiple converging pressures reach a critical intensity, a moment when the cracks that have been widening for years become impossible to ignore, even by those most invested in maintaining the illusion of stability. And this framing is significant because it shifts the question from what specific disaster will occur to what systemic failures will become undeniable, which is a far more psychologically destabilizing question, because it implicates not external forces, but our own institutions, beliefs, and choices. The first interpretation worth examining, though it will not be labeled as such because enumeration creates a false sense of separation when these predictions are better understood as facets of a single disintegration, involves imagery that Nostradamus scholars have connected to the collapse of mediating institutions, those structures that stand between individual citizens and raw power or chaos. Courts, regulatory bodies, international agreements, shared protocols for truth verification, and the implicit social contracts that govern behavior even when enforcement is absent. In several quatrains, whose dating remains contested but which certain chronological theories associate with the mid-2022s, there appear references to judges without robes, laws spoken in reverse, and the Great Assembly dissolved in silence. Language that resists literal interpretation but which, when read as symbolic description of institutional decay, becomes chillingly relevant to contemporary trends in which legal systems are increasingly perceived as political instruments rather than neutral arbiters, in which international bodies lose enforcement capacity and moral authority, in which the norms that once constrained executive power or corporate behavior erode without formal announcement or public acknowledgement, creating a situation where the forms of institutions remain visible while their actual function has hollowed out, a condition that leaves populations confused about what rules still apply, who has legitimate authority, and what recourse exists when systems fail to deliver justice or protection. This is not a prediction of courtrooms burning or constitutions being torn up in dramatic public ceremonies, but something far more insidious. A gradual recognition that the institutions we relied upon to mediate conflict, enforce accountability, and maintain some baseline level of fairness have lost their capacity or willingness to do so, not because of a coup or revolution, but through 1,000 small surrenders, compromises, and corruptions that accumulate until the system functions primarily to protect itself rather than serve its stated purpose. And the psychological impact of this recognition is severe, because it removes one of the primary buffers against despair, the belief that even when individual actors behave badly, the system itself will eventually correct course. And when that belief collapses, it creates a kind of moral freefall, in which people begin to question not just specific institutions, but the very possibility of justice, fairness, or collective action, which in turn makes them more vulnerable to authoritarianism, nihilism, or withdrawal from civic life entirely. The connection to 2026 emerges through multiple pathways. Legal challenges to democratic processes that create constitutional crises without clear resolution mechanisms. The exposure of corruption, so systemic that reform seems impossible. The failure of international bodies to respond effectively to crises that require coordinated action, or the simple accumulation of precedent-breaking decisions that erode the predictability and neutrality upon which legal systems depend. And while none of these outcomes is certain, the trend lines are concerning enough that serious observers across the political spectrum have begun warning about the fragility of institutional legitimacy, which is precisely the kind of slow-motion fracture that Nostradamus's most unsettling imagery seems designed to evoke, not as external disaster, but as internal decay, not as something that happens to us, but as something we allow to happen through inattention, rationalization, or exhaustion. The human impact of institutional collapse is not immediate violence, but rather a creeping sense that the rules have changed without announcement, that the strategies for navigating life that once worked no longer apply, that there is no authority to appeal to when wronged, and that the only safety lies in personal networks, tribal affiliations, or raw power, which naturally accelerates polarization and makes cooperation across difference increasingly difficult, creating feedback loops that deepen the very fragmentation that caused the institutional failure in the first place. And this is the kind of prediction that disturbs most deeply, because it describes not a discrete event but a process, not a problem that can be solved but a condition that must be endured. And it raises the uncomfortable question of what kind of society emerges on the other side of institutional collapse, whether new legitimate structures can be built, or whether we enter a prolonged period of uncertainty in which competing power centers claim authority without consensus, and populations must navigate life without reliable frameworks for resolving disputes, verifying truth, or planning for a future that feels increasingly opaque. Moving into different symbolic terrain without announcing transition, another cluster of imagery attributed to Nostradamus and linked through various interpretive methods to the 2026 timeframe involves what might be called the collapse of shared reality, described through references to mirrors that show different faces, words that change meaning with each speaker, and the great library burning while no one notices. Language that early commentators struggled to understand, but which contemporary readers might recognize as eerily prescient descriptions of information warfare, algorithmic manipulation, and the fragmentation of consensus reality into incompatible narrative bubbles. This prediction is particularly disturbing because it describes not the loss of information but the loss of our ability to collectively determine what is true, a condition in which different populations operating from incompatible factual premises cannot even engage in productive disagreement because they cannot agree on what constitutes evidence, what sources are reliable, or what events actually occurred. And while this phenomenon has been building for years through the rise of social media, partisan news ecosystems, and sophisticated disinformation campaigns, certain structural analyses suggest that 2026 may represent a tipping point, a moment when the fragmentation becomes so severe that basic governance, collective action, and social cohesion become nearly impossible, because there is no longer sufficient overlap in perception to enable compromise, negotiation, or mutual understanding. The mechanism of this collapse involves multiple reinforcing factors. The continued sophistication of artificial intelligence in generating synthetic media that is indistinguishable from authentic content, making it possible to create convincing video or audio of any public figure saying anything, which destroys the evidentiary value of recordings and makes it impossible to definitively prove or disprove claims about what was said or done. The increasing customization of information feeds so that different users see completely different versions of reality based on their behavioral profiles and engagement patterns, creating a situation where neighbors literally inhabit different factual universes. The weaponization of leaked documents, hacked communications, and out-of-context information to create scandal narratives that overwhelm institutional capacity to investigate or respond. Collapse of local news ecosystems that once provided community-level consensus about basic facts, leaving populations dependent on national or international sources that are more easily politicized and less accountable. And the simple exhaustion that comes from constant information warfare, in which populations become so fatigued by conflicting claims and counterclaims that they retreat into either total cynicism or absolute faith in whatever narrative feels most emotionally satisfying, both of which destroy the possibility of evidence-based discourse. The Nostradamus quatrains that seem to describe this condition do not speak of technology, because technology is merely the mechanism, but rather of a society in which truth becomes untethered from verification, in which competing narratives coexist without resolution, and in which populations lose the ability to distinguish between what they wish were true and what actually is true, which is a far more profound crisis than simple disagreement, because disagreement at least implies a shared framework for evaluation, whereas the loss of shared reality creates a situation in which there is no common ground from which to even begin dialogue, and populations fragment into mutually incomprehensible tribes that view each other not just as wrong but as incomprehensible, as operating from such fundamentally different premises that communication becomes impossible. The prediction for 2026 inches. This context involves not a single information catastrophe, but rather the accumulation of these trends reaching a threshold beyond which basic societal functions become paralyzed. Elections that are impossible to certify because majorities of the population on different sides refuse to accept any result that contradicts their narrative. Public health responses that fail because populations cannot agree on basic facts about disease, treatment, or risk. Economic coordination that breaks down because different sectors are operating from incompatible understandings of market conditions, and international cooperation that becomes impossible because nations cannot establish shared factual premises for negotiation. This is the fracture of epistemology itself, the breaking of our collective capacity to know things together, and it is perhaps the most insidious prediction because it attacks the very foundation of civilization, which is not technology or law, but the ability of humans to coordinate action based on shared perception of reality. And without that foundation, every other institution becomes impossible to maintain, not because of external attack, but because of internal incoherence. Because we can no longer agree on what problems exist, what solutions are appropriate, or what outcomes we are trying to achieve, and populations caught in this condition experience it not as a grand ideological battle, but as a grinding, exhausting confusion in which every claim must be questioned, every source is suspect, and the very attempt to establish truth becomes a political act, which naturally leads to withdrawal, radicalization, or a kind of strategic ignorance, in which people choose to know as little as possible to avoid the psychological burden of navigating incompatible realities. Without announcing a third interpretive thread, we must consider the imagery in certain Nostradamus passages that describe environmental or atmospheric changes that affect human psychology and behavior directly, references to air that maddens, seasons that betray, and the earth that exhales confusion, which early interpreters understood as poetic descriptions of plague or climate, but which contemporary analysis might connect to the psychological and physiological impacts of environmental degradation, pollution, and climate instability, particularly as these factors compound stress, anxiety, and cognitive impairment across entire populations. The disturbing element of this interpretation is not the environmental changes themselves, which are well documented and increasingly visible, but rather the suggestion that these changes create psychological effects that make populations less capable of rational response, less able to cooperate effectively, and more vulnerable to manipulation or panic, essentially creating a feedback loop in which environmental stress degrades human decision-making capacity at precisely the moment when sophisticated decision-making is most necessary. And certain forecasts suggest that 2026 may be a year when this dynamic becomes particularly acute, when the accumulation of climate impacts, air quality degradation, microplastic contamination, and other environmental stressors reaches a threshold where their neurological and psychological effects become impossible to ignore, not as individual medical problems but as collective phenomena, affecting millions of people simultaneously, and creating behavioral changes that appear irrational or inexplicable without understanding their environmental origins. Research has increasingly documented connections between air pollution and cognitive impairment, between heat stress and increased aggression, between environmental toxins and neurological dysfunction. And while these effects are typically studied in individual or small group contexts, the implication is that populations exposed to these stressors at scale will exhibit collective behavioral changes: decreased capacity for complex reasoning, increased irritability and conflict, reduced impulse control, heightened anxiety and paranoia, and difficulty maintaining focus or long-term planning, all of which make effective governance, social cohesion, and collective problem-solving more difficult. And when these effects are combined with the institutional fragility and information collapse described earlier, they create a situation in which populations become simultaneously more stressed and less capable of responding to that stress in organized ways, more anxious about the future, and less able to think clearly about what actions might improve it, more aware that something is wrong and less able to identify what it is or how to address it. The prediction for 2026 inches. This framework involves not a single environmental catastrophe, but rather a recognition moment, a point at which the accumulated psychological and physiological impacts of environmental degradation become undeniable and begin to be understood as a collective condition rather than individual problems. And this recognition itself is traumatic, because it reveals that the degradation has already occurred, that populations have already been affected, and that there is no clear path to reversal or mitigation, that we are operating with diminished capacity at precisely the moment when we need peak capacity, and that the environmental changes that cause this condition are themselves products of the very cognitive and social dysfunctions they now exacerbate, creating a loop that is extraordinarily difficult to break. The human experience of this condition is not dramatic illness, but rather a sense of being slightly off, of thinking less clearly than one used to, of feeling more irritable or anxious without obvious cause, of struggling to maintain attention or emotional regulation. And when these experiences are shared across millions of people simultaneously, they manifest as social phenomena: increased conflict over trivial matters, decreased patience for complexity, heightened suspicion of others, and a general sense that something fundamental has shifted in human interaction and capability, but without a clear explanation or framework for understanding what has happened, which naturally leads to scapegoating, conspiracy theories, and the search for human villains to blame for what is actually a systemic environmental condition, further fracturing social cohesion and making coordinated response even more difficult. Continuing without formal segmentation into what might be called the fourth area of concern, certain quatrains have been interpreted as describing the failure of economic security systems and the psychological trauma of discovering that the implicit promises of economic participation can evaporate without warning, referenced through images of coins that become worthless overnight, granaries that are full yet people starve, and labor that produces nothing, which seems to evoke not traditional economic collapse marked by unemployment or inflation, but rather a more subtle dysfunction in which the mechanisms for converting work into security, for saving against future need, and for planning financial stability simply stop functioning in predictable ways, leaving populations that followed all the rules and made all the responsible choices suddenly vulnerable without having made any obvious mistakes, which is psychologically devastating because it removes the belief that prudent behavior offers protection, that effort correlates with outcome, that there are reliable strategies for securing one's future. And when that belief collapses, it does not just create financial hardship, but existential disorientation, a sense that the basic bargain of modern life has been broken, and that there is no clear alternative framework to replace it. The mechanisms through which this might manifest in 2026 are multiple and interconnected. The potential destabilization of debt-based economic systems as interest rate fluctuations and geopolitical tensions create cascade effects that governments struggle to contain, the exposure of pension systems and retirement accounts as insufficient to meet their obligations, forcing mass recognition that millions of people will not be able to retire as planned, the continued hollowing out of middle-class economic security through inflation, housing costs, and wage stagnation that accumulate to a breaking point, where majorities of the population recognize they are working harder for less security than previous generations. The automation and artificial intelligence displacement of knowledge work previously considered safe from technological disruption, or the simple recognition that climate change and resource constraints make long-term economic planning impossible because the assumptions about future conditions that underlie all financial modeling are no longer valid. What makes this prediction particularly disturbing is not poverty itself, which humans have endured throughout history, but rather the collapse of the narrative that linked effort to outcome, that promised security to those who worked hard and played by the rules, that suggested there were reliable strategies for protecting oneself and one's family against want. And when that narrative collapses, it does not just create material hardship but a profound crisis of meaning, a sense that the entire structure of modern life was a kind of lie or delusion, that the authorities who promised these outcomes were either incompetent or malicious, and that there is no reason to continue participating in systems that demand sacrifice and discipline but no longer deliver promised rewards, which naturally leads to either resignation or revolt, neither of which creates conditions for the kind of collective action and social solidarity that might actually address the underlying problems. The human impact is not just financial stress but a kind of existential whiplash, a realization that the future one planned for will not arrive, that the strategies one employed were futile, that the sacrifices one made were meaningless, and that there is no authority or system that can restore what has been lost, which creates fertile ground for demagogues, promising simple solutions, for conspiracy theories that offer villains to blame, for withdrawal into survivalism or nihilism, or for desperate attempts to recapture lost security through increasingly extreme political or economic movements that promise restoration of an order that may never have been as stable as memory suggests. The final interpretive thread, though again not labeled as such to avoid artificial enumeration, involves what certain Nostradamus scholars have identified as imagery, describing the collapse of generational continuity and the breaking of implicit intergenerational contracts expressed through references to children who do not bury their parents, the old who consume the young, and names that are not passed down, which seems to evoke a society in which the normal transmission of culture, values, resources, and opportunity from one generation to the next breaks down, creating populations of young people who see no future for themselves within existing systems and populations of older people who recognize they have failed to provide for those who follow, and this mutual recognition creates a kind of temporal fracture in which society loses the thread of continuity that makes sacrifice and planning meaningful, because both require the belief that actions today will create conditions for others tomorrow, and when that belief dies, it takes with it much of what makes human communities function across time. The 2026 connection here involves demographic and economic realities converging, the potential exposure of healthcare and elder care systems as catastrophically underfunded at the same moment that the largest generation in history begins requiring intensive support. The recognition that younger generations face prospects categorically worse than their parents across multiple dimensions including climate, economics, and institutional stability, breaking the fundamental promise of intergenerational progress that has underwritten social cohesion for centuries. The continued extraction of resources and opportunity from future to present through environmental degradation, debt accumulation, and infrastructure neglect that amounts to a form of temporal theft, and the simple psychological reality that parents and grandparents who came of age in an era of expansion and possibility find themselves unable to offer their children the same opportunities and increasingly aware that they may have participated in systems that actively harmed the future their descendants must inhabit, which creates a toxic mixture of guilt, resentment, and helplessness that corrodes family bonds and social trust across generational lines. This fracture manifests not in open conflict but in a kind of mutual incomprehension and withdrawal, in which older generations cannot understand why young people seem so anxious, hopeless, or angry, and younger generations cannot comprehend how their elders could have been so reckless or blind, and this failure of understanding creates a situation in which the normal mechanisms for cultural transmission, mutual support, and collective action across age groups become impossible, leaving populations fragmented not just by politics or information bubbles, but by temporality itself, by fundamentally incompatible orientations toward time and possibility. The psychological impact of this generational fracture is profound for all involved. Younger people experience it as abandonment, betrayal, and the foreclosure of futures they were promised, leading to despair, rage, or a kind of paralyzed nihilism. Older people experience it as guilt, defensiveness, and the recognition that they will not be remembered fondly, that they failed in the most fundamental obligation of any generation, which is to leave the world better than they found it. And the collision of these experiences creates social dynamics marked by blame, resentment, and the breakdown of the implicit contracts that once made it possible for people at different life stages to cooperate toward shared futures, because those shared futures no longer seem achievable, or perhaps even desirable to those who must inhabit them. And when hope for the future dies, much of what motivates present sacrifice dies with it. These 5 interpretive threads, though they have been presented separately for clarity, are not separate predictions but rather different facets of a single pattern that Nostradamus, whether through genuine foresight or deep understanding of historical cycles, seemed to perceive and attempt to describe. The pattern of civilizational fracture. The way that complex systems under stress do not collapse cleanly, but rather break along multiple fault lines simultaneously, with institutional decay enabling information chaos, which exacerbates environmental stress responses, which destroys economic security, which fractures generational bonds, each breakdown making the others worse, in a cascade that accelerates until it reaches either catastrophic failure or some form of stabilization, at a lower level of complexity and coherence. And the reason 2026 emerges as significant in certain faithful 10 interpretive traditions is not because it is the moment of final collapse, but because it may represent a threshold, beyond which the fractures become too wide to bridge, beyond which the narrative of recovery or restoration becomes impossible to sustain, and populations must face the reality that they are living through, not a temporary crisis, but a fundamental transformation, a shift into a different kind of reality with different rules, possibilities, and constraints, and that the world they knew or believed in is not coming back. This convergence is what makes these predictions genuinely disturbing, in a way that simple disaster prophecies are not, because disasters are discrete events with clear beginnings and ends, but systemic fracture is a condition, an ongoing reality that must be navigated without clear resolution, and populations caught in such transitions experience them not as dramatic catastrophes, but as a gradual grinding down of possibility, security, and coherence, a sense that each year things get slightly worse, slightly more confusing, slightly less manageable, without ever reaching a crisis point that might force decisive action or provide the clarity of obvious disaster. And this gradual erosion is psychologically exhausting in ways that acute crisis is not, because it offers no relief, no clear enemy to fight, no obvious solution to pursue, just the daily work of managing decline and trying to preserve meaning, dignity, and connection within systems that are failing in slow motion. However, and this is crucial, these interpretations represent extreme trajectories, worst-case scenarios in which current trends continue without interruption, adaptation, or resistance. And while such scenarios are worth examining because they reveal the stakes and clarify the dynamics that we must interrupt if we are to avoid them, they are not inevitable. They are conditional, dependent on the choices that populations, institutions, and individuals make in response to visible stress. And the value of confronting such dark possibilities is not to create despair, but to create clarity. To understand with precision what must be defended, what must be changed, and what must be built if we are to navigate stress without collapse, to pass through pressure without fracture. And the question becomes not whether we can prevent all of these dynamics from manifesting, but whether we can reduce their severity, slow their acceleration, or create pockets of resilience that preserve human capacity, dignity, and connection, even within systems that are failing, which is a more modest but more achievable goal than preventing catastrophe entirely, and perhaps more honest about the situation we actually face. The psychological and practical work of facing such possibilities without succumbing to panic or paralysis involves several elements that are worth making explicit because they represent forms of agency available even in conditions of significant constraint. First, the cultivation of accurate perception, the practice of seeing what is actually happening rather than what we wish were happening or what authorities tell us is happening, which requires distinguishing between signals and noise, between genuine structural change and temporary fluctuation, and between catastrophism and complacency, neither of which serves clear thinking. Second, the development of emotional resilience, not through denial or suppression, but through the capacity to hold difficult knowledge without being destroyed by it, to acknowledge fear, grief, and anger without being controlled by them, and to maintain the ability to find meaning, connection, and purpose, even in conditions of decline or uncertainty. Third, the preservation and creation of small-scale systems of mutual support, local networks, and human relationships that can provide material and psychological security when larger institutions fail, which does not mean retreating into isolated bunkers, but rather building horizontal connections that create webs of resilience, independent of fragile hierarchical systems. Fourth, the maintenance of ethical frameworks and moral commitments even under pressure. The refusal to abandon principles of dignity, honesty, and care simply because systems are failing or because others are behaving badly, which is difficult but essential, because the preservation of humanity through crisis depends on enough people refusing to participate in its dissolution. And fifth, the clear-eyed assessment of what cannot assess and cannot be controlled, focusing energy on actions that might actually make a difference, while accepting that many dynamics are beyond individual influence, which is not fatalism but realism, the recognition that wisdom involves knowing where effort is most likely to be effective and where it will simply be consumed without result. None of these practices guarantee safety or prevent suffering, but they do create possibilities for endurance, for maintaining the capacity to think clearly and act ethically under stress, and for building the kinds of relationships and capabilities that become crucial when institutional support disappears. And in this sense, the most useful response to dark prophecy is not to argue about whether it will prove accurate, but to use it as motivation for the kind of preparation that makes survival possible and dignity achievable, even in worst-case scenarios, which paradoxically makes those scenarios less likely, because populations that have developed resilience, clear perception, and ethical commitment are harder to destabilize and more capable of collective action when it becomes necessary. The peculiar nature of prophecy is that it functions not as fixed prediction, but as warning, not as description of unavoidable fate, but as clarification of consequence, and in this sense, even the darkest visions serve a constructive purpose if they motivate the changes that make them obsolete, which is perhaps what Nostradamus understood when he chose to write in symbolic language rather than clear prediction, creating texts that resist simple interpretation and force readers to engage actively with possible futures, rather than passively accepting inevitable fates. And whether he possessed genuine foresight or merely deep insight into recurring patterns of human failure, the result is the same: a body of work that continues to generate reflection, discomfort, and hopefully action among those who encounter it seriously. The year 2026 will arrive regardless of prophecy or interpretation, and what it holds depends far more on the choices being made now in institutions, communities, and individual lives than on any quatrain written 5 centuries ago. Yet the act of contemplating worst-case scenarios, of sitting with discomfort and uncertainty, of refusing both false optimism and paralyzing despair, creates a kind of mental and emotional preparation that has value independent of whether specific predictions prove accurate, because it develops the capacity to face difficult realities without fragmenting, to maintain agency in conditions of constraint, and to preserve connection and purpose when external structures fail, which are capabilities that become necessary in any prolonged period of instability or transition, regardless of the specific mechanisms involved. If you have stayed with these reflections through their full development, if you have been willing to sit with discomfort and uncertainty rather than demanding either reassurance or sensationalism, then you understand something important about the relationship between prophecy and awareness, which is that the point is never to predict the future perfectly but to perceive the present accurately, to see the fractures before they become breaks, to recognize dynamics while they can still be interrupted, and to maintain the clarity and commitment necessary to act effectively, even in conditions of significant uncertainty. And if this approach resonates with your own sense of how to navigate complex times, consider marking your engagement by leaving your name and city in the comments, not as performative gesture but as genuine signal that there are others who prefer difficult truth to comfortable illusion, who understand that awareness is not the same as fear, and that confronting dark possibilities can be a form of strength rather than weakness. And share these reflections with those in your life who might benefit from this kind of sober analysis, not to spread anxiety but to encourage the kind of clear-eyed engagement with reality that makes resilience possible. Because ultimately, the most frightening predictions are not those that describe external catastrophes, but those that reveal internal weaknesses, not those that announce unavoidable disaster, but those that show us how our own failures of perception, courage, or commitment create the conditions for collapse. And in that sense, the worst predictions about 2026 or any year are not about what will happen to us, but about what we might allow to happen through inaction, confusion, or despair. And the best response to such predictions is not to argue about their accuracy, but to ensure through our choices that they remain merely warnings rather than becoming descriptions of the world we actually inhabit.